and I welcome all of you to our third lecture, Seleukid lecture in the fall. I start by extending warm greetings by my co-host, Rabbi Ben Scolnic, whose first duty as being a rabbi has kept him from attending today because he has to officiate a funeral. He might join us a little later today, but this is not for certain. And you will see me a little distracted because I have to let in other colleagues manually. So this part of the programming hadn't worked. Anyhow, we are looking forward to listening to an exciting presentation by Dr. Kyle Erickson from the University of Trinity St. David in Lampeter, Wales. Well, Kyle is, well, by now already an old friend of mine. Our friendship goes back to the Seleukid, the falling of the Anchor conference in 2008, when Kyle was still a PhD student. And we started working on the Seleucids together ever since, well, which resulted in the first Seleukid study day at Exeter in 2011. So a long series to which Kyle has been contributing constantly. He has made quite a career in the meantime, so climbing up the ladder from a lecturer in his department of classics to become the head of department. And for about 2 years or so, he is now the director of academic experience, but his love for the Seleucids is still glowing. And so amongst his many publications, I only mention the 4 books that he is responsible for. First, the proceedings of the 2008 conference together with Gillian Ramsey. Second, a volume on the Alexander romance co-edited with Richard Stoneman. And in 2018-19, his 2 major Seleukid works were published. First, the Bordeaux conference on conference papers on the 3rd century war within the family, and most importantly, a revised version of his PhD on the iconography of the early Seleucids. So Kai will be very well qualified to speak on ideological constructs of the early Seleucids. We have also well, our expert who will be giving feedback is no less distinguished. I was quite surprised to see the number of the publications of Dr. Stefano Caneva. For some time we have been corresponding, and for several years now, time and again, I see new publications of his on the Hellenistic world, especially on the Ptolemies and on the ruler cult. But I was quite impressed to see the number on Academia Edu, 63 papers and 5 volumes. Outstanding are his work on the early, his book on the early Ptolemies, published in 2016, well, the development of the ruler cult from Alexander to the Theoi Adelphoi. And also his work on the materiality of the ruler cult, a co-edited volume published recently. So well, and I was no less impressed when I looked at the academic stations that Stefano has passed through, and I could not memorize them all, starting in Pavia, going on in San Marino, where he got his PhD. And well, I've heard of this miraculous state somewhere in Italy, in Europe. I didn't know that it has a university on its own. It may be the 2nd smallest state in the world, just after the Vatican State. I don't know, but it's fantastic to have this on his CV, followed by Toulouse, Groningen, Leuven, Liège, Rome, Padua, Brussels, and now he is professor at Padoa. So this is an outstanding career. And we all look forward to hearing you, Kai, present and you, Stefano, respond, and then facilitating a discussion for all of us. Now I see that the screen has already been shared, so the floor is all yours, Kai.
I don't think that's my screen, so I'm going to attempt to...
Oh, this is not your screen?
No.
This should be yours, but you should change the... Can you unshare again?
Wait,
now,
did that work?
Okay, there we have it.
Second. All gotten tiny. Okay. So thank you very much, Altay, for that discussion, introduction, and Stefano. I'm now even more terrified than I was previously, only having read your publications for many years. I will just jump right in. So one important priority for ruling elites after a change in governing regime is establishing their new status as legitimate rulers. Even in modern democratic governments, where the legitimacy of the new government is less often in question, there still remains a series of performances and careful use of symbols designed to showcase the legitimate transfer of power. Thus, in countries with strong traditions of governmental legitimacy, these traditional elements help to confirm the passing of power even after closely contested elections. The 2020 American elections tested the power of these symbolic acts of transferring legitimacy from one group to another, as the outgoing President Trump sought to undermine the legitimacy of the underlying process. And that is still ongoing, and we don't know the consequences of that for the United States. Normally, the appearance of the outgoing president at the inauguration of the new president ideologically underpins the notion of a continuity of legitimate government. But following the 2000 and the 2016 American elections, the inaugural ceremony successfully marked the transition of one president to the next, even if they did not end most of the political discussion about an illegitimate presidency. Unless we consider that this is solely the result of the modern democratic tradition, a similar case could be made for ancient transfers of power, with the attendant ritual performances. Today, I'll explore how the early Seleucid court exploited those means of representation and communication that they did have at their disposal to create the image of a legitimate Seleucid king. And I argue that this propaganda helped enable them to successfully transfer power from one generation to the next. Now, in states without institutionalized processes for transferring power, a wide variety of options are available to establish a legitimate new regime by establishing the status of the new elite as the rightful rulers. In the cases where the new power has overthrown the previous establishment, as was the situation of Alexander in Persia, several options, I believe, are available. The old power structure can be presented as illegitimate in an effort to reduce its status. An older power structure can be revised to the status of a golden age that has now returned, or the new rulers can claim a new mandate to rule based on other factors. Now, none of these possibilities are mutually exclusive, nor does employing any of these methods require that they match the reality on the ground. For example, the removal of the so-called Persian yoke from Egypt by Alexander in real terms did not require a wholesale dismantling of the prior system of rule or the complete removal of all the major political players. Thus, the establishment of a new regime does not actually need to replace all of the old structures of power. The process primarily needs to elevate the status of the new ruling elite and to create a perception of change. Now, for the successors of Alexander the Great, these problems were more acute and more complicated. First, the king they sought to replace had already developed an uneasy balance between the Macedonian and Persian dynastic traditions. Furthermore, he governed, much like the Achaemenids, through a range of subordinates, both Macedonian and non-Macedonian, whose loyalty he had courted extensively or simply replaced. In many cases, these subordinates had developed their own bases of power in the regions with their own long dynastic traditions. Above all, the empire appears to be bound together by Alexander's personal charisma and his favor. Now, as a result, after his death in Babylon on the 11th of June, the ghost of Alexander continued to exercise an inordinate amount of influence over his successor's claims to power. They were faced with the challenging options of establishing themselves in the traditional Macedonian ruling house while lacking essential Argead blood, establishing their own power relying on local elites, or appealing to various pasts in the regions that they attempted to claim. Now, recent scholarship has demonstrated how the Diadochoi and the Epigonomoi, the first two generations, manipulated Alexander's image to establish their status as legitimate sovereigns. Now, further, the vast array of the new communities under the Macedonian rule presented new opportunities to exploit different possibilities of kingship within a regional context. As a result, the development of royal propaganda for each of the kingdoms took place not in a vacuum, but part as a dialogue, not only between the dynasty and the local populations, but also between the emerging dynasties as well. In the Ptolemaic kingdom, a dual approach was taken depending on audience. For the Greek audience, they could be presented as the legitimate successors to the Alexander, and for the Egyptian audience, presented as legitimate pharaohs. Lysimachus appears to have based his status mostly on his service as Alexander's bodyguard and claims to succession straight from Alexander. Now, that legitimacy building process developed a different narrative in the Seleucid Empire than the others. Like the other successors, Seleucus first claimed his status as a candidate for rule based on his personal service with Alexander, thus presenting himself as a legitimate heir to at least a share of Alexander's empire. As his own success increased, he moved from attempting to present his status as Alexander's heir to presenting himself as a new ruler with his own divine support. Now, this necessity of transforming his status from general to satrap and finally to king required that Seleucus convince an array of audiences, his Macedonian soldiers, Babylonian priests, Iranian nobles, to name but a few, of his new status and power in a wide variety of different ways. Now, like the other successor kingdoms, the formation of the concept of the Seleucid kingdom was not a single act, but needed to be constantly reinforced through a range of actions, from civic foundations, temple dedications, temple rededications, athletic, dramatic, musical competitions, festivals, performative speeches, history, movements of the king, and as Cosman argues, uniquely through the quantification of time. Now, a complete survey of Seleucid dynastic creation is well beyond the scope of today. We don't simply have enough time, but I think it's important to note there are a few major gaps in our understanding of Seleucid propaganda before focusing more narrowly today. For the early Seleucid period, we generally lack two important types of evidence for this repeated performance of Seleucid power that are present elsewhere, such as in Ptolemaic Egypt, such as praise poetry and honorific statues. Now, lacking both of these categories of evidence for the Seleucids, although I think undoubtedly they did exist, today I'll instead explore how coinage can be used to highlight shifts in the narrative of legitimacy for Seleucus I. Through their wide circulation, royal coinage remains the best documented medium of Seleucid propaganda. They were one of the mechanisms that circulated new images of Seleucid dynastic power both within and outside of their frontiers. Furthermore, the adoption of similar dynastic imagery by the Parthians and the reoccurrence of some elements of Seleucid myth-making in the later dynastic traditions of Iran suggests a degree of effectiveness in the creation of Seleucid kingship ideology. Now, one of the most significant efforts on the part of the Seleucid court to enter into competition with their immediate predecessor, Alexander, and with the other successors is revealed in how they presented their status according to their heritage. The literary results of this competition, I believe, is evident in Appian's account of the Seleucid Empire. In his Roman civil wars, Appian provided not only the extant history of the Seleucid house. This narrative focuses mainly on Rome's war with Antiochus III, but he ends his account with a summary of the history of the dynasty. Now, in combination with these scattered accounts and other authors, we can observe a set of dynastic foundation myths which the Seleucids created for themselves. A narrative of divine support, which confirms Seleucus' status as rightful ruler, can already be seen in Appian's account. The relevant chapters 52 through 64 of the Syrian Wars can be briefly summarized as follows. This section opens with Seleucus receiving an oracle from the god at Didyma, which foretells his death. Next, three kingship myths follow. The first is Seleucus' receipt of his anchor signet ring from his mother. The second is the story of the self-starting fire that ignites when he sets out from Macedon, followed by the conclusion of the story concerning the ring. And lastly, the final episode, which involves the loss of Alexander's diadem in the marshes of Babylon and Seleucus's recovery of it. Appian's narrative then continues with a short summary of Seleucus's career and moves to the list of his city foundations. Following this description of Seleucus's foundations, he shifts to tracing the legitimacy of Seleucus to tracing the legitimacy of his son by relating the story of the transfer of Seleucus's wife Stratonice to Antiochus and the attendant speech. He then relates the foundation myth of Seleucia and the Tigris, and finally describes Seleucus's death in Europe with a repetition of the Didymean oracle. Now, each of these episodes in Appian's narrative serves to confirm Seleucus and his sons' status as kings. Now, in Appian's narrative, the outlines of the methods of narrative construction the Seleucids utilized to establish their legitimacy in competition with the other Diadochoi evident. One way in which this would have been done was through exploitation of the various myth-making tendencies that seem to have proliferated around Alexander after his death. In fact, as Fraser suggests, Appian's narrative does bear a generic resemblance to the Alexander romance that may well be purely fortuitous. This resemblance may be more than fortuitous and reflects a tradition that Appian adopted that consisted of a series of stories that served to legitimate the Seleucid dynasty in a way very similar to how the Alexander romance may have originally served to establish Ptolemaic legitimacy. In fact, as Ogden argues, it stands to reason that the two traditions arose simultaneously and drew on an increasing body of oral tradition both in the Near East and Egypt in developing narratives to justify the emergence of the two new powers. Following Ogden, I argue that this narrative, which also appears on Seleucid coinage and likely on other no longer extant media, was designed to shift the narrative from Seleucus as a subordinate to the king Alexander to Seleucus as rightful king in his own right. Fundamental to this narrative was the foundations of cities, both in Babylon and Syria, and the integration of the elites in both areas into supporters of the Seleucid royal project. Now, before turning to the creation of Seleucid mythology, I wish to briefly comment on how the most successful rival to the Seleucid house, the Ptolemaic kings, sought to present their founder Ptolemy as an equal of Alexander and used him to prop up their claims to rule. Perhaps owing to the fact that they possessed Alexander's body, the Ptolemies always honored Alexander as the founder of their dynasty through dynastic cult. However, there was one notable exception to the subordination of the Ptolemaic image to that of Alexander. During his reign, Ptolemy II elevated his father to new status, and in doing so, moved him into an equal with Alexander. This status was not only through cult, but through repeated, either through festivals or poetic verse, as well as coinage. This approach to using Alexander by the Ptolemies was not tied to the same structure of power which developed in the Seleucid Empire. Although many have been misled into thinking that the Seleucids presented themselves in the same manner because of the powerful visual impact of Antiochus of Comageni's monument to himself at Nemrut Da, the placement of Alexander at the head of the Seleucid ancestors in that monument has often led to the assumption that he was also placed there by the Seleucids. There's no evidence that Alexander was portrayed as an ancestor or as tutelary deity in the early Seleucid court. For example, the priest list of the Seleucid cult at Seleucia Imperia begins with the gods and then proceeds to the kings, beginning with Seleucus, Zeus, Nicator. Unlike the Ptolemaic pantheon in its list of kings, here Alexander has no place in the lineage. Rather, this separation of the Seleucid house from Alexander, I believe, was part of a deliberate policy which began under Seleucus I and reached its culmination in the reign of Antiochus I, with the creation and subsequent repetition of a new dynastic mythology centered on Seleucus and his sons' emergent status as kings. In order to assess how Seleucus came to play a new role and therefore supplant Alexander as the foundation of royal status for the Seleucid Empire, we first must establish the role Alexander played in early Seleucid propaganda. Seleucus made very limited use of Alexander's image compared to his rival successors, in particular compared to Ptolemy and Lysimachus. Early in his reign, mints under Seleucus's control reproduced the same types produced under Alexander, with a series of sporadic developments that introduced Seleucus's own symbols. Outside the modification of Alexander's types, Seleucus only produced a single version of an image of Alexander, which appeared at 3 Eastern mints in a relatively limited time, likely 300 to 298. The design of the coinage at all 3 mints is nearly identical and marks a significant change in the iconography of Seleucid coinage, which has hitherto been a continuation of Alexander's types. The obverse of the new coin type featured the head of Alexander facing to the right in an elephant headdress with skin tied around his neck in imitation of the Alexander Heracles type. Interestingly, this innovation was heavily dependent on earlier Ptolemaic coinage. But while the overall image of this coinage is similar to the early Ptolemaic versions, the removal of specific characteristics such as the horn of a moon and the mitre would have attempted to make this image more useful as part of a Seleucid claim to the status as the heirs of Alexander's Eastern Empire. However, it seems that the choice of image may have been too similar to the Ptolemaic version, and thus it proves ineffective as a marker of Seleucid status. Now, in attempting to place the significance of this iconography for Seleucus, this image is normally taken to refer to one or all of 3 closely contemporaneous events: Seleucus's campaign to India, his victory at Ipsos, and/or the foundation of Seleucia on the Tigris. Now, all 3 events were utilized elsewhere in Seleucid myth-making to highlight Seleucus's success and legitimacy as a sovereign, and it seems likely that this coinage was designed to enhance that image. However, this is also part of a dialogue with Ptolemaic image-making. The interpretation is equally difficult, as it may be taken as an assertion of an equal claim to Ptolemy's mantle of a successor to Alexander, or perhaps as a threat to the now disputed Ptolemaic territory in Courland, Syria, or even an acknowledgement of both kings' status and power as successors of Alexander. Taking this into account and the prominence of elephants on the rest of Seleucid coinage, the failure to reuse this image strongly suggests that it quickly ceased to fit into Seleucid propaganda or failed to resonate with an audience, likely Macedonian soldiers within the empire. Indeed, the brief appearance and then removal of the explicit link between Alexander and elephants on Seleucus's coinage may elucidate part of this renegotiation of his status as he moved from satrap to the successor to Seleucid king. The elephant headdress coinage might mark the final act of Alexander imitatio by Seleucus as he shifted from the position of satrap to legitimate successor to Alexander, and then finally into Seleucid king. Initially, Seleucus had exploited the potential to be Alexander's favored successor through a series of logoi highlighting his potential for future rule. If these were circulating, they would have laid the groundwork for his claims to the diadem, the most prominent example being the lost diadem highlighted in Appian. Ipsos then marked a clear turning point in the relation of the successors, both between each other and to Alexander. Before the battle, the reunification of the empire, or even Europe and Asia under Antigonus, had remained a very real possibility. After the battle, it appears that only Seleucus still held the ambition and the power to reunite the whole kingdom. While this dream was never formally abandoned by any of the Hellenistic kings, after the battle, for the most part, it seems to have ceased to exist as a practical ambition. For Seleucus, his recent successes and his greater goal of reuniting Alexander's empire may have inspired him to take up the mantle and image of Alexander. That anti-Antigonid propaganda, which is preserved in Plutarch, that dream in which Alexander abandoned Antigonus and Demetrius before the Battle of Ipsus for Seleucus and Lysimachus, fits as the capstone of this transition. The circulation of this story would have represented a clear shift in support from those who still look to Alexander's closest circle as the ultimate authority. However, his performance as a potential heir must have failed to connect with the armies, as Seleucus soon appears to abandon this attempt. It seems likely that Ptolemy's stronger claims and control of Alexander's body seems to have prevented any other successor from securing this status as the true heir of Alexander. As a result, it appears that Seleucus rather quickly abandons his attempt to utilize Alexander's image and to establish his status as an heir to Alexander's empire. Instead, he shifts his focus and tactics and began to replace the links to Alexander with his own claims of personal success and asserted his own status as a legitimate Zeus-favored king. While focusing on the developing and severing of links between Seleucus and Alexander in the early Seleucid court, it's important to be mindful of the fact that the Seleucid dynasty's relationship with Alexander was never stable, and later, likely beginning in the mid-2nd century, began accelerating again under Antiochus III and against Roman reflections on Alexander. And Alexander appears to have regained prominence in the Seleucid court. The perhaps most notable example of this is the reemergence of Alexander as a royal name later in the dynasty. Further, we must be mindful that Appian preserves only a fragment of the Seleucid discourse, and that alternative versions of many of the same episodes would have circulated with differing emphases. Now, turning to Appian's digression, which accompanies most of the fantastical stories about Seleucus, it is neatly encapsulated by the repetition of the oracle from Didyma, which concerns Seleucus's kingship and death. This oracular pronouncement fits within a Greco-Macedonian narrative, but it's not necessarily the case for all of the stories. In fact, many of these stories were probably recognizable by a variety of audiences as they tapped into older Near Eastern traditional narratives. Now, after the first telling of the oracles, Appian's digressions goes through the kingship bit, which we have outlined before. Now, the first two are interpreted as a form of divine favor. The first statement that fire bursts forth from his ancestral hearth is normally interpreted as a sign of his future kingship. Well, this sign of divine favor in Appian does clearly seem to express or be linked to Seleucus's future kingship. Its placement close to the other prophecies concerning his kingship and its similarity to Pausanias' version suggests that this is what it should be about. It's perhaps telling that Appian does not explicitly include Alexander and Seleucus's setting out from Macedon, as Pausanias does, but it might be unimportant in the brevity of Appian's narrative. Now, this story would have been understandable for a Greek or even a Roman audience. The process of divination by flames and the possible connection to Iranian fire temples makes it tempting to also place this story within an Iranian context. The multiple possible locations for the story alongside its potential Iranian elements suggest that this story at least has two traditions, one that emphasizes Seleucus's divine favor on his own, and one that emphasizes his divine favor in light of his connection to Alexander. Now, it's possible that both stories circulated initially. More likely, the version preserved in Pausanias circulated first, highlighting the connection to Alexander, and the version preserved in Appian highlighting a slightly changed emphasis on Seleucus's own status, particularly within an Iranian context. The second story is more extensive, and it is worth examining the text briefly, as once again Alexander is not mentioned. This story serves to highlight two functions in Appian's narrative. The first is that it closely develops an ideology for the prominent use of the Seleucid anchor on coinage, while Seleucus was still a satrap. And the second is that it prophesizes a Greco-Macedonian narrative. It prophesizes his future kingship. Further, it notably puts that prophecy in the mouth of his initial protector and later rival Ptolemy. And this tale is connected, the two stories, by their functions as ideologies for the Seleucid anchor. And the first has often been connected with the longer birth myth recorded in Justin. Now, the myth contained here in Justin 15.4 can be broken down into three elements, all present in Appian. The story concerning the anchor signet ring, as in the Appian logoi, the story of divine verse from Apollo, and the elements of the story from the self-igniting fire. although here the ring serves as a symbol for divine favor and possible kingship instead of the self-ignited fire as in Appian. While Ogden has analyzed the various elements of these stories, it is worth highlighting how each element of the narratives preserved in the Roman sources can highlight Seleucus's relationship to Alexander or also serve to obscure it. And the anchor symbol seems to appear as the key element of the emerging Seleucid iconography, which demanded an explanation from the early chroniclers. The anchor was relatively common on the coins of Seleucus I and may have been the official marker on Babylonian seals, which often appeared as early as 312 after his return to Babylon, and has prompted a variety of explanations, including his service as Navarch under Ptolemy and a Babylonian symbol of various sorts. However, if we accept that the logoi in Appian and Justin are of Seleucid origin, then we should not reject the notion that the anchor was a personal symbol of Seleucus that may have even had its origins in his family before he left for Macedon. Here, the literary narratives attempt to explain the use of this symbol throughout Seleucus's growing kingdom. Within this context, it is perhaps unsurprising that the anchor origin stories reflect only a tenuous connection with Alexander, as the legend may have only begun to circulate as the stories about Seleucus's origin hinted at a more divine origin. As with the fire legend, the Babylonian symbolism and the importance of the river Euphrates may have been modified out of old, non-extant Babylonian legends, which created another audience who were required to confirm Seleucus's status as king. Appian's third story concerning the future kingship of Seleucus does not fit together in the same way as the first two. The story goes roughly as follows. While Alexander was surveying the lagoons around Babylon, the wind blew off his diadem and it landed on a tomb. Someone swam to collect the diadem and placed it on their own head to keep it out of the water. The person was either rewarded or killed, depending on the version that occurs. And we have versions additionally in Arian and Diodorus. And it has long been clear that this is part of a narrative tradition around Alexander's death and should perhaps be linked to the Near Eastern tradition of the substitute king. Now, the various swimmers and their various different possible outcomes show how these narratives circulated in a wide variety of guises through the entirety of the Hellenistic period and well into the Roman period. However, Appian's inclusion of Seleucus within this tradition demonstrates the Seleukid dialogue with this type of narrative. As this tale likely originated near the time of Alexander's death, it is perhaps best to see Seleucus's appearance in the story as an early element of Seleucus' claims to rulership, where he most prominently highlighted his connection to Alexander. Perhaps even initially during his first period as satrap in Babylon, or more likely once he has established himself there for a second time. Thus, the first section of Appian's digression on Seleucus comprises two different sets of stories. The first is the story concerning the fire anchor, and the second is the story with Alexander's diadem. The first set could have connections with Alexander, but the versions present in Appian lack these references, and therefore create a narrative of Seleucid legitimacy without reference to the king. Thus, it seems probable that despite their order in Appian, the fire and the anchor versions preserve a later version of Seleucid myth-making than the diadem narrative. However, these legends likely circulated in multiple versions or chains depending on their audience and continued to circulate through the entire empire. For example, the stories concerning the anchor ring may have developed in two stages and generated at least two traditions. The first version, which accompanied Seleucus' starting fire, explained Seleucid kingship through divine favor. And if we're to judge by Pausanias' version, that is all likelihood his connection to Zeus. And the second stage, which specified Apollo as the god who specifically favored Seleucus. Now, there is no reason to believe that the myths were exclusive of each other and that they could have circulated in a variety of formulations depending on audience, its preconceptions, and location. Unfortunately, both the extant and Mesopotamian and Iranian literary sources, scarce though they are devoid of examples of Seleucid myth-making. As these seem to be the narratives that are reflected in Seleucid coinages, in particular the use of the anchor and, of course, the diadem, it appears that their repetition through both the narratives and iconography formed an important part of the process of establishing Seleucus' status as a Seleucid king, with diminishing reference to Alexander. Furthermore, we can see that these narratives have elements which could have been understandable by different cultural audiences. The same can be said for the development of Seleucus's iconography, as we will see below. When combined with the Apollo birth myth in Justin, which is also epigraphically attested, we see a version of Seleucid royal status that is not dependent on Alexander, but directly parallels Alexander's own claims to divine descent from Zeus. One final area of competitive propaganda that appears within Appian's narrative is the demonstration of heroic status by conquering an animal. Within a Greco-Macedonian context, the story retold by Appian bears a striking resemblance to other stories of heroic strength by the other dialogues. Appian gives us the following. Physically, he was well-muscled and large, and once when a bull broke free from its bounds at the sacrifice of Alexander, he blocked it by himself and wrestled it down with his bare hands. For this, they add horns to his representations. In contrast, Lysimachus used the four parts of a lion as his personal symbol in a similar way to the use of the Seleucid horned horse or the bull by Seleucus. This symbol may have referred to the story in Curtius Rufus, in which Lysimachus killed a lion single-handedly. Ptolemy's heraldic animal appears to be the eagle, which linked him to both Zeus and Alexander, and might have alluded to the story of his own birth, where he was exposed and saved by Needle of Zeus. The use of personal symbols tied to the important stories by the other successors suggests that the Seleucus bull logos served as an explanation of both the horned representation of Seleucus and the representation of his might, and therefore legitimized claim to kingship. Now, the image of a central male figure fighting one or more animals, as was a standard feature of Mesopotamian art by the 3rd millennium BC, we can see the successor tapping into this traditional imagery. Now, it's perhaps telling that while bulls appear on coinage of a number of Seleukid mints, Sardis, Magnesia on the Menander, Tarsus, Antioch Carai, Seleucia on the Tigris, Susa, Ecbatana, and Icanu, the well-established glyptic iconography of a figure fighting a bull doesn't appear. This might be because seal imagery, where this image is particularly common, does not appear to have been translated across into Seleucid coinage, and further that the types of image used by Seleucus tended to be Greek in style. However, it continued as a seal type. It is not only Seleucus's defeat of the bull that held significance in Mesopotamia, but also the horns attached to his helmet or attached to his head. And the bull is not exclusively a Mesopotamian. The bull is not exclusively a Mesopotamian image either, but also had significant iconographic importance within Persia as well as in Greece. As Oliver Hoover pointed out, through the iconography of the bull, Seleucus connected himself to native Iranian imagery and the broader Zoroastrian concepts of holiness and legitimacy. As with the other performances of Seleucid power, we can glimpse through Appian's narrative the use of Taurine symbolism could have spoken to a wide range of audiences by utilizing their own cultural inheritances. The evidence for the success of this dialogue is difficult to determine. I've argued elsewhere that the Medusa bull coinage produced by all the Seleucid bronze mints was an attempt to foster an imperial image across the entirety of the empire. Furthermore, that this attempt was not continued suggests that this empire approach was not successful. However, as the image of the bull-horned king and the bull-horned horse appear to have been a success, as the image continues to appear throughout the dynasty in a variety of mediums, from coins to Babylonian seals to statues, and even into the Alexandrian Romance tradition. The ultimate test of the efforts to legitimize power is the ability to pass it successfully on to the successor, the achievement that eluded Alexander and several of the other diadocs, including Lysimachus. I believe for Seleucus, the creation of a series of new legitimating mythologies repeated through a variety of mediums, including coinage, seals, new civic foundations, that helped move first from officer to satrap, then his successor to Alexander, and finally to his equal, And it was this last step that was taken ultimately by Seleucus in conjunction with his son that allowed him to present himself as an all-powerful king with the ability to create royal status for his son, with whom he first tested this by sharing power. Finally, with his succession secured, he could take the final step of his separation from Alexander and have himself declared the son of a god. His son could then take this process one step further and make his father a god himself, and thus attempt to create an image that superseded Alexander within the empire. Now, as I hope I've shown, Seleucus's attempts to legitimate his rule did not take place within a vacuum, but in dialogue not only with Alexander's memory, but also the developing traditions of the other Diadochs and the inherited legacy of Near Eastern kingship. Now, not all of the attempts by Seleucus and his court to craft this image were successful. Nevertheless, Seleucid kingship ideology established itself within a framework of Near Eastern and Iranian kingship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kai, for these intriguing observations. Well, I pass the word on immediately to Stefano for his comments.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great. So thank you very much, Kyle, for this inspiring presentation. And before I start, I would also like to thank again Altay for inviting me to take an active part in this Seleucid lecture. I've enjoyed very much preparing my response to Kyle's paper, and I hope I can bring a useful contribution to this discussion. Let me first of all praise Kyle for dealing with a complex and debated set of sources from two very promising perspectives. Firstly, you have stressed a seminal methodological point, the relationship between the Seleucids and the religious sphere, including the creation of foundational narratives of divine support, should be studied through all the available types of evidence. Secondly, you have reminded us that the construction of legitimacy in one kingdom cannot be properly understood out of its web of relationships with the other contemporary dynasties. The same is valid for later developments of narrative traditions concerning Seleucus. And we all know Daniel Ogden's book, The Legend of Seleucus. And I'm happy that today you have been building up and consolidating these results with an intermediate approach focusing on texts and coins. In your presentation, you have distinguished between two sets of narratives in relation to whether they explicitly refer to Alexander or not. So the first group comprises the stories about the anchor and the self-igniting fire at Seleucus' ancestral hearth, and the last has a variant testified by Pausanias about wood autonomously catching fire on the altar where Seleucus was accomplishing a sacrifice before leaving Macedon. In these episodes, Alexander only appears in the background. The stories are related to Seleucus' participation in the expedition against Persia. Conversely, the episode of the fall of Alexander's diadem in the Babylonian lagoons stages an explicit narrative of transfer of power from Alexander to Seleucus. And this message is consistent with the Appian adopting a Seleucid depiction of Seleucus as the diadoch who more than any other managed to equate Alexander in the extension of his empire, especially in relation to the East. I'm convinced by your argument that we should not contrast these groups of stories in a static way. The absence of explicit references to Alexander in the first group does not mean that the stories about the fire and anchor had nothing to do with the re-elaboration of the memory about the Macedonian king. The fact that these episodes were shaped and transmitted through a plurality of layers of oral and written traditions, which we can only speculatively trace, implies that we should assume the existence of multiple versions, including variants. Thus, the stories we find in authors from the imperial period can more fruitfully be discussed with an idea of diachronic development in mind. In principle, this does not mean that the episodes displaying no direct reference to Alexander are necessarily later, but that the stage of elaboration, which is conveyed by later authors, points to a period when the construction of the figure of Seleucus was already based on his own life and successes. I think that you show that comparison with the numismatic iconography strengthens this picture of diachronic development. On the coins minted by Seleucus as a satrap of Babylon, it appears as a personal mark on the obverse of what, in other respects, is a faithful copy of Alexander's silver tetrarchons with Heracles and the enthroned Zeus. Later, for a short period after Ipsos, a gold stater displaying the profile of Alexander with the elephant exuvia was issued by Seleucus in the means of Babylon, Susa, and Ecbatana. And this type had a well-known Ptolemaic precedent, as you stated, commemorating Ptolemy's conquest of Alexander's body from Perdiccas. Unlike the Ptolemaic type, however, Seleucus Alexander does not combine the elephant skull with Ammon's horns or Dionysus' mitra. And I would like to recall that roughly in the same years after Ipsos, Lysimachos did precisely the opposite. He issued coins that depicted Alexander with the ram horns and diadem, but without the elephant exuvia. I'll come back to that. The defeat of Antigonus and Demetrius at Ipsos implied that the other diadochi reasserted their right to be the successors of Alexander, although in fact Ipsos, as you stated, made any attempt to reconstruct the unity of his empire impossible for at least 2 decades until Seleucus' successful war against Lysimachus. I was intrigued by the passage you quoted from Plutarch when Alexander appears to Demetrius in a dream on the eve of Ipsos to announce that he will move to the side of his enemies who will receive him. In Greek, apeimi toinun prostus enantius, ekeinoi gar me paralambanusi. And incidentally, I would like to stress the semantic power of the verb paralambano because the term is regularly used to refer to the intergenerational transfer of kingship in Hellenistic dynasties. Moving back to coins, comparing the initiatives of Seleucus and Lysimachus can prove particularly useful as they show that the winners at Ipsos claimed their own control over the memory and legitimacy of the Macedonian king and did so by fashioning their own Alexander. Seleucus erased the most typically Ptolemaic features of Alexander and used the elephant to highlight his own link with Alexander's conquest in the east. One could also state that Seleucus' portrait of Alexander simplified the memory of the king, removing the multiple divine attributes that constitute prominently Ptolemaic features and possibly influenced by iconographic tradition. As you have pointed out, the presence of Alexander on a limited series issued in 3 Eastern mints after Ipsos was the first and last innovation on Seleucus coins that explicitly referred to Alexander. The importance of elephants in the Seleucid army and ideology and their enduring success on Seleucid coins, yet never again in connection with Alexander, allow us to identify another step in the progressive replacement of Alexander as a source of legitimacy with new topics that directly pointed to Seleucus' achievements and his legacy. I also think your presentation raises a fundamental question on which you might perhaps still develop your observations a bit further. In my opinion, not only the presence or absence of Alexander, but also the question of identifying the chronological and geographical settings of the fiction, of the myth-making episodes is very interesting. So, I have tried to go through the various episodes with this question in mind: where and when do they take place according to the narrative? Well, a first point that I could catch is a well-known one. The conquest of Babylon after Antigonus' occupation was the reconquest of Babylon was a seminal moment for Seleucus' myth-making process. But according to me, a geographical analysis of the narratives also shows that Babylon, more than the Syrian Tetrapolis and Seleucia on the Tigris, offers Seleucus a chance to shape his figure in terms of imitation first and later of emulation and replacement of the figure of Alexander. And I would say unsurprisingly so, because Babylon held a central place in the memory about Alexander, whereas the other cities were new foundations linked with the creation of a Seleucid political space. In a part of the episode set in Babylon and in those concerning the foundation of Seleucid capitals, Alexander's stories work as an underlying canvas, or if you prefer, the stories about Seleucus flourish as a palimpsest upon the motives and patterns defined by the ongoing development of the tradition about Alexander. I would like to conclude my response by isolating three topics for further discussion. To begin with, the absence of Alexander from the list of Seleucid ancestors remarkably differs from the Ptolemaic eponymous priesthood of Alexander and the dynastic couples in Alexander. However, we should distinguish this typically Alexandrian institution from what happened in the Egyptian Hora. The important architectural programs carried out in Egypt in the Egyptian centuries, in particularly in the Theban area, date to the reigns of Philip III and Alexander IV, when Ptolemy was still a satrap. In the indigenous temples, Alexander lost his relevance as early as the reign of Ptolemy I, which perhaps brings us to a closer comparison between the Ptolemaic and Seleucid, or at least the Egyptian and the Seleucid way of dealing with Alexander. On the other hand, interestingly enough, you mentioned the return of the memory of Alexander at an onomastic level in the 2nd century, which we can also find in Ptolemaic Egypt with the 10th Alexander, a little bit later than with the Seleucids. My second point concerns the stories about Seleucus Anchor. They, of course, relate to the dream made by his mother Laodice, so they refer to Seleucus' noble origins, to his also Macedonian origins, but they have a distinctive Babylonian setting. Seleucus loses his signet ring in the Euphrates. He stumbles upon an anchor stone in Babylon. In the latter episode, when the question is about the meaning of Seleucus stumbling upon the anchor stone, the role played by Ptolemy definitely resonated in my mind with the role Ptolemy has in a version of the Romance. Actually, we have it in the Armenian and in the Latin version of the Romance. We know that after the death of Alexander, the Macedonians and Persians are discussing about where to bury Alexander, and Ptolemy intervenes in the debate, saying that it is important to interrogate the oracle of Babylonian Zeus, and the oracle will reveal that the body shall be sent to Memphis. So this episode raised in my mind an important question, I think. How do we deal with historical characters in these narrative traditions that are transmitted by imperial sources? How far can we read them against an historical background? And in this case, we could say, oh, the role of Ptolemy refers to the period when Ptolemy was supporting Seleucus in recovering Babylon from Antigonus. How far can we instead read these episodes and the role ascribed to these characters from a more narrative, I would even say narratological perspective? Ptolemy becomes the helper in various traditions. This is just an example to raise to focus the discussion also on how we deal from an historical point of view with this later narrative tradition. And my last point, which I fear can only open the path to speculation, but I believe that a workshop is also interesting for this. Scholars have convincingly associated the meaning of Alexander with the elephant skull on the rare numismatic types issued by Seleucus after Ipsos, with the message portraying Seleucus as a new Alexander in the East. So this interpretation provides, I believe, a satisfactory explanation for the choice of the three Eastern mints where the coins were issued. However, earlier, I mentioned the fact that after Ipsos, Lysimachus also circulated a variant of the Ptolemaic type, where other aspects of Alexander's legacy were underlined. So my question is, why did Seleucus reuse Alexander's deified portrait only in the eastern regions of the empire and not in Syria, Phoenicia, and eastern Anatolia? Before giving back the floor to you, Kyle, I would again like to thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I think we are getting closer to what I would like to define as a global comparative history of the myth-making strategies that accompanied the establishment of the Hellenistic dynasties. And I'm happy to, I see this as a collective effort, and I'm happy to say that I believe your work is offering an important contribution to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefano, for your very thoughtful and rich comments. Well, actually, this could be a paper on its own, and we will probably see it developed very soon. I think Kyle would like to respond to your observations, at least to some of them.
First, I'd like to say thank you, and I agree particularly with the three questions you've raised at the end. And that approach on comparative history is the only, I think, is the only way we can start to understand the early Hellenistic period and what survives. I'm not sure which to sort of start off on first. I think interestingly around Alexander in Egypt and the disappearance of Alexander from the Egyptian Chori makes me more and more convinced that Alexander is more important to Greeks than he is to any other population. And that a lot of the discussion about who is king and what kingship means should be separated in a Greek concept, in a Greek or a Greco-Macedonian conception and a non-Greco-Macedonian conception. And that Alexander features far more largely in a Greco-Macedonian, and I want to include Rome in that as well. That Alexander seems to be the touchstone for the Romans, for the Greco-Macedonians, and therefore features in that context. Whereas I think for the Babylonians and for the Iranians, the Alexander legacy is far more complicated. And in some ways, I think that comes back to the final bits, and I think we'll come back to it on the Alexander in the East. It always stands out to me as extremely odd. I don't think that coinage is focused at local audiences in the East. I think it must be focused at the army, even more explicitly. I think all coinage is primarily focused at the army, but with some idea of local audiences. But it seems surprising at that point, when Alexander has moved into territories he's just taken, that Alexander doesn't appear after Ipsos. And that new Seleucid images show up, and that I find very interesting. And I do wonder if it had to do with Alexander's status. I think we can't push the appearance of historical figures in any of these stories very far. But I think David's paper in one of the earlier Seleucid study day volumes about the Iranian later reception of many of these stories highlights that in some ways known historical figures seem to be able to be dropped in and out of these narratives depending on how well the authors happen to know what historical figures might happen to have been around at the time. That Ptolemy might appear because we know who Ptolemy is. And we can't do that. But I like the idea of the development of narratological perspectives on how each of these kings might have been perceived in the various narratives that go up, and then how they reappear. the parallel one that baffles me is Seleucus's appearance. The statue of Seleucus in the Alexander romance that shows up on the walls of Alexandria, it has never been explainable to me. And I just can't do it. Although I missed, and I'm now annoyed at myself that I missed Ptolemy as the one to have the consultation of the Babylonian Zeus oracle in the Armenian version. Because of course you get also in some of the versions that Seleucus is one of the two who sleeps in the temple of Serapis in Babylon on a consultation of what to do about Alexander's death. And that you have both of them playing around with probably, if historical at all, which I'm not certain of, that same request for consultation of the gods about what to do about Alexander in Babylon centers around the two of them is really interesting in the romance. But that might also just be the prominence of the two of them in the traditions where the romance is developed. And I don't think we can ever disentangle that entirely. And I'm not sure we should be, because I think that also says something about the narrative creation, that you need to pick up the right historical figures to make it a both believable narrative, but also a narrative that circulates in a meaningful way. But yes, that weird popping up in about 300 of Alexander images by everyone, but Seleucus only really out in the East, is interesting. And I do wonder how much Lysimachus's model is a rejection of the Ptolemaic model with a new version of Alexander that's tied to Lysimachus personally. Although it's got so many Egyptian elements, that's interesting as well.
So I'm not sure if you have finished your first row of responses, and I saw Stefano very attentive and nodding, and I think he would like to respond first a little bit. So I'm happy to give the two of you another couple of minutes to develop your thoughts together before the rest of us kick in. We are still good as far as time is concerned.
Well, thank you, Altay, and thank you, Kyle. In fact, I knew I was asking a big question. We're not expected to receive a clear answer, but I agree with the orientation you proposed. And well, basically, I can say I'm very satisfied with what I've heard today, and I think there is a strong basis for, as I said at the end, for broadening up the scope and trying to see more and more how these elements fit with her, and if it is possible to identify patterns that work transversely both at the period of the Diadochi and in the later development of narratives. And I totally agree. We should pay attention not to choose between searching for historical meaning in these later narratives and focusing on the narrative function of it. As I said, when you were talking about this, it's absolutely resonated with my former reflections on, for instance, the Liber de Morte or the Testament of Alexander. There has been a lot of discussion about the fact that in one passage of the Romance, Alexander gives Egypt to Perdiccas, and starting from this, a lot of theories have been brought to the public concerning the hypothesis that there were originally different layers of the Testament. But on the other hand, as you said, I think that for these later narratives, sometimes what was important was just to mention known figures. So Perdiccas was known, and maybe in that point what counted was just to create a credible narrative, because these narratives had also a significance and a purpose for the public of the imperial period. So my reply to your answer is actually it doesn't bring anything new to our discussion, but thank you very much for accepting the challenge of my questions and to build and for building up on that.
Okay, thank you very much to both of you again. And well, in the meantime, actually for a long time, I do see Ben amongst us, so welcome. And I'm not sure if you want to say something right now.
If Kyle is still there, I'd love to. Okay. First of all, Kyle, thank you for a wonderful paper. I emailed you earlier because I didn't know if I was going to be here. Can I ask a side question about Appian? So, you know, I'm a sort of a very simplistic person. I think about source criticism, that one kind of source criticism is, you know, where did this stuff come from? So when I'm thinking about Appian's discussion about Seleukid history, I know there's been a lot of work, and Ogden has done work, and other people have done, where, you know, what were Appian's sources? So that's one kind of source criticism. But the other kind of source criticism is, why is he talking about this? So if I remember correctly, the first half of that book of the Syrian Wars is all about Antiochus III in Rome. And then there's some little part I don't remember. And then he goes into what he explicitly says is a digression. He goes backwards in time. So this is like the backstory. This is the prequel. So then he gives all of these things that you're talking so eloquently about. But why? And so I remember once reading, I think it was John Rich, I don't remember exactly, who said, well, it was just sort of filler. He needed to fill up the rest of the book because he was only halfway through, but I can't really buy that. I mean, this is got to be more serious than that. And I think about that statue that you referred to. And I'm thinking about Appian living in Alexandria, right, where the statue was. And I'm just wondering if there wasn't some stuff in the culture about Seleucus going on. And why would he, at that point in history, why would he go into this whole discussion? So you're talking eloquently about what that tells us. But so my question is sort of a side question. What does it tell us about Appian that he'd be writing about this?
I don't think I think it is Rich, if I can't remember, that argues that it is just filler. I've never bought that it's just filler.
Good.
I think because he goes through and he does a sort of whole potted history of the entire dynasty.
Right.
Which is the sort of longest potted history we have of the dynasty.
Right.
But almost all of the rest of it is who killed who in the sort of very briefly juicy stories.
And I think he talks about Demetrius the First a lot, but you're right. It's a lot about Seleucus the First, and basically he's just following some king list or something like that and going through.
And part of me thinks, it's the interesting stuff.
Okay.
Some of it is it's the nice it's the thing that has
the juicy stuff. Right.
It's okay. The good juicy stuff that's there, so you stick it in, and it seems to be the stuff that's in more than one story, i.e. Pausanias is able to pick up bits of it, Diodorus has bits of it, so it's the stuff it's the juicy stuff that's around that people might know. So if you're going to pick up everything that's in the dynasty, you pick up that type of story bit.
Right. And yet it is giving, I mean, it's giving a lot of play. You're right, it's juicy and a lot is good, and these are great myths, and they are interesting stories, and they are memorable. And yet I just wonder if there's something deeper in there someplace, that somehow, you know, Seleucus the First is in the culture. I don't know.
I do wonder that, and the thing that's always I've never quite been able to figure out is the Cultendura Europus, which seems to be 2nd, 3rd century.
Right.
AD.
Right.
And seems to be a reemergence of something that I'm not sure ever existed in the Seleucid period or in the 2 centuries before it. is there this weird bit of revival and a picking up of Seleucus? It fits if you're putting Appian in the middle of the second sophistic and is looking back to origin stories,
Right.
and therefore you're picking up all the early Hellenistic stuff.
Right.
But it's confused me for years, and I have no good answer.
Okay, but I'm glad you have the question.
Thank you. And well, this is the right time for everyone to kick in. The easiest, since I would not see you raising your hands because most cameras seem to be off right now, that you use the emoji function. At the bottom, you see the smiley. And at least on my screen, when you click it once, you see at the very top of it the raise hand function. So that is easiest for me to see that you want to contribute. In the meantime, I ask the most pressing question that I have. There was a lot of intriguing stuff, and of course the start again with the January 6th iconic picture of the stormed Capitol. Of course brings up questions in us as to what kind of light does this shed onto the materials that we are studying day in, day out in antiquity, on the one hand. On the other hand, what messages we might have from our study of the ancient world back to our time, to our students, to the public that we have chances to address and messages to bring. So I've been musing a lot about this, and of course seeing this image for such a long time at the beginning of the paper revived that. That's just a side remark. But the most interesting piece that I found from the documentary evidence you have shown, Kyle, is the Alexander with the elephant tusk coin that you date to 300 to 298. It's I have it on the slideshow that you kindly shared with me beforehand. So it's the gold statere. Well, the main question does not relate to a detail we can see. It's rather the question, how firm is the date? I am not trained as a numismatist, and when I see that basically there is no era date on it, these were not yet in use for coinage. So normally it's the counter marks or the die or the mint chronology. I've browsed quickly through Houghton-Lauber, which I've had at hand, but I didn't see a firm date that might not be based on our historical assumptions. I, on my side, see it fits perfectly into this time frame and would like to draw on this to also support my own reconstructions of some sections of Seleucid ideological history, especially since I've worked on the Milesian documents recently. But I see the risk of circularity, and I would really want to know how firm the date the date for this coinage especially is. It seems to be fitting so well, sending out a new message after Ipsos, but then shortly changing that message when the conflicts with the Ptolemies arise. And I would even add to it that once we have the documentary evidence from Miletos, I would argue that connections with Apollo started, and it's the very low starting point. I think this is now also within the general trend. Kyle himself has contributed to this and many others. So my point here would be against the more traditional view that the connection with Demodamas, the Milesian, was not very close before the exchange and before the benefactions of the Seleucid family in Miletus, but rather they seem to be a starting point, and the initiative, I think, might well have been the Seleucid court rather than the Milesians. and that would be a shift away from other ideological messages. It would be a shift on something new, something genuinely Seleucid, something other than Alexander. So it all fits very well. And the chronology, if 298 is even right, then I can, some of my observations would further support this chronology, because the traditional date to the inscriptions from Didyma, of the Apama inscription or the Antiochus inscription, they have been dated to roughly 299, but this has been on a wrong assumption and on a very fragmentary reference to a Stephanophoria, which is actually only, if we can draw on it at all, it's just a terminus postquem and not a date to a firm date to 299 to 98. So we would actually gain some time to date the Milesian evidence and to focus on Miletus a little later, perhaps 298, 297, 296, 295. All of these years are possible, and we would have even more room to fit in this Alexander coinage. But I am afraid now myself, what is the basis for dating the gold statere of Seleucus? So I was expanding my thoughts to give you some more time to browse Houghton-Lover, Kai.
Okay, it is what I thought, which is that it's not, none of them look die-linked to anything, annoyingly.
But if anyone else has something, please kick it in right now. Kyle is still immersed in this most beautiful catalog.
I would like to make a question, if I may.
Sure.
Well, more like a couple of questions. Well, first of all, thank you, Mr. Erickson, for your presentation. It was really interesting, and thank you a lot for your works on the Seleukid early iconography. Those have certainly helped me a lot with my PhD so far. So, in your opinion, if it is true that Seleucus tried to distance himself as much as possible from the iconography of Alexander, is it possible that the Susian coin, I think it is Susian, that represents a hero assimilated to either Alexander or Heracles, the one with the helmet with the panther skin, could it be showing Seleucus instead of Alexander or Heracles, in the sense of that he is the conqueror of those areas in India and the Far East? And in any case, I would like to know your opinion of on that type of covers. And my second question would refer to the other coin, the one that showed the horned horse. To what extent do you think is it possible that this coinage could be connected to an evocation of the power of the cavalry, of which he had been commander after the Babylonian conferences? Knowing that the origin of this, or well, thinking or guessing that the origin of this type may be in the mix between the horns of the bull and the story of Seleucus' horse that saved him in combat against Antigonus.
Thank you, Cesar, for your questions. Is this coin type, yes?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, I'm convinced that that's Seleucus and not Alexander or Heracles.
Well, then thank you very much.
I'm not sure everybody agrees with me. I know Vesta Curtis doesn't, and I know.
Yeah, I think Smith and maybe most of the people I have read for my PhD doesn't. Well, they don't agree with you, but I think I agree with you that this must be Seleucus.
Yep. I know Andy Meadows thinks it's Alexander. If you connect it with the horned rider coinage as well, I think that's probably also Seleucus. rather than Alexander. The horns don't match anything that we see ever for Alexander anywhere. And it matches everything we get for Seleucus, both sort of about that time and also later. So I don't see why we need to create an identification of Alexander other than there seems to be a reluctance to say that Seleucus is moving away from Alexander's imagery, and that the only person you could possibly put on coinage is Alexander, rather than the king himself. But I think it also moves him closer into what Demetrius is doing, where Demetrius is about claiming kingship, starting to portray himself on coinage in a similar bit. So I think there's a reluctance to push that Seleucid, or to push Alexander back into the early Hellenistic kingdoms as the prime bit. So I strongly think it's Seleucus. Your other question was about the horned horse.
May I just kick in before you move on to the next question? Just quoting from Marion Meyer's comment in the chat box. She endorses your view also with a view to the nose. So it's a relatively realistic portrait, different from that of Alexander, and I would agree with her. And I also think the eye types are more typical of the Seleucids than of Alexander. So
I'm still also not entirely convinced that those are panther spots, but I'm not sure what they might otherwise be.
But sorry for the interruption, just wanted to share that with the whole group.
For the second one, yes, I think the horned horse is probably connected with the Seleucid cavalry. In addition to the narrative about Seleucus escaping Babylon from Antigonus on a horse, but I think it is. I think it is very much part of a version of promotion of Seleucus's own background, and also the importance of the cavalry. And I think, I haven't got it here, I think my favorite Seleucid coin is the elephants pulling the chariot, and the elephants as cavalry, and that combination of elephants and cavalry, I think just it reinforces the sort of the cavalry imagery of Seleucus. And again, the horned rider, the rider bit, that Seleucus is almost always connected in some way to horses. And actually, I could probably use that to further that argument that the horned rider is Seleucus and not Alexander. Although, of course, Alexander has his own equal connections to cavalry. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, it answers every question I had. And thank you again.
Who else would like to ask questions or make comments? Any kinds of comments will be welcome. We will not extend this this meeting or the recording at least for too long. We want to be a little bit more disciplined after having gone over 2 hours in our first lecture series. But I think another 5 minutes or so are easily in our time budget. So does anyone have further questions? Well, I always have questions while you're still thinking about your question. Then I have one for Stefano. Both of you mentioned the anchor again and showed early anchor coinage, and that is, well, I saw it in kind of a discourse with Eva Anagnostou Laotides, our speaker from last month, who delved into the topic of the anchor and explored it especially from a potential Babylonian perspective, trying to connect it to the old Babylonian stateship ideology, which I found very good as a complementary argument, though I think that the consensus was that it is a Greek, Greco-Macedonian, if not a Greek symbol. Also, the image itself is a Greek anchor, and it doesn't stand in any iconographic tradition. But the choice in Babylon to make this the main dynastic feature may well have specific Babylonian contexts and arguments. And then you said, Stefano, in your argument that well, you started your second point when the second from the three listed points towards the end of your intervention. You started with the anchor motif, but then digressed towards other Babylonian motifs, such as the Babylonian Zeus oracle, and well, relating to the funeral of Alexander the Great. And I didn't see how you actually bound back the anchor to any Babylonian tradition. So I'm very curious what your view on this is.
Yeah, sorry, I must have been a bit unclear. Actually, I didn't want to argue for a Babylonian tradition, but I was just recalling what I had proposed before, that we should also try to not only to distinguish the different episodes about Seleucus and his legitimacy according to the point of whether Alexander is there or not, but also try to contextualize the narrative where it takes place, to try and understand which purpose a certain narrative could have. And I only wanted to point out that the emperor comes out constantly in with a reference to Babylon to justify Seleucus' control over Babylon. I didn't want to argue that it had a reference to Babylonian tradition. So yeah, I think I've only been a bit unclear. Sorry.
Okay, thank you for clarifying this. But well, then I direct my question more towards Kyle again, and that is yet again another question pertaining to the chronology or the date of coinage. As far as I remembered from Eva, it's a relatively new perspective or argument that there is early anchor coinage. And it seems, while browsing through Houghton Dorber, there's actually a lot which is in a larger time frame of, well, at least the second period. And your date on the slides, Kai, was not very clear. I think well, I think I know what you wanted to say with the date, but you had the years 315 to 311. Did you want to write 312 to 11, or did you want to say before 315 and after 311?
In fairness on that, I actually just stole it off the ANS website, and that's the dates on the ANS website.
Well, yeah, I didn't pick that out. You sent me your slides earlier, but I just concentrated on the written text and on the images on the slide, but I ignored the.
But 312, 311 would make sense.
Yeah, which is at the beginning of the return of Seleucus, and it's still early, though not in the first satrapal period.
I think it might be in the Meadows collection, the linked open world Alexander volume. They might push it back earlier. I can't remember, but it is clearly. It's clearly before Seleucus claims the title, because it is Basileus Alexandru on the coin. So it's prior to 306. And I think people wanted, are there anchors on the Mazius coinage? I think. So I think pushing it early is fairly okay in terms of the date. But again, I don't think there's anything countermarked.
Yeah. Well, the big question would be whether we might push it before 316. I don't really have the knowledge to make judgments on my own based on countermarks and die studies. I normally have to follow the authorities of the numismatists, but I am afraid that sometimes there is some circularity involved, and it would make the big difference. It would, if we have a coin that we can firmly date before 316, then we could firmly exclude the interpretation of the anchor as referring to Seleucus's time as the admiral of Ptolemy, which is a very problematic interpretation, even if the date is somewhat later. Well, unless there are any further questions, then I would like to thank both of you, Kyle and Stefano, once again for this very intriguing discussion, which doesn't end with our session today. This will be ongoing, and I look forward to seeing it unfold further and to further learn from you. And the next colleague that we will be learning from in this setting is Stephen Harrison from Swansea, yet another Seleukidist scholar from Wales. I don't know how Wales has been able to attract all these Seleukid scholars, well, also including our friend Alex McAuley from Cardiff. So Stephen will talk about Antiochus at Daphne and Xerxes at Sardes, a comparative perspective on the Seleucid vision of empire. And his talk will be given on December the 15th. Expert feedback will be given by our friend David Engels from Warsaw. So I would like to leave you with my best wishes for the rest of the fall and for the fall term, and all the best. Stay safe, stay happy, stay healthy. See you all hopefully soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you again, and thank you for that January 6th stuff, because those of us in America are going out of our minds these days, and it's